This is the Lest We Forget podcast, a historical podcast by Tenement Yard Media. I'm Gabrielle, your host. A quick trigger warning before we begin. This episode discusses a plane crash, injuries, and death resulting from it. In the mid-1970s, the first and only mid-air bombing of a civilian airliner in the Western Hemisphere took place. The 1976 bombing of Cubana Airline Flight 455 resulted in the deaths of 73 persons and became one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in Caribbean history. Picture this. It's October 1976 and the Cuban national fencing team is on a high. The 24-member team, made up of mostly young adults, dominated the Central America and Caribbean Championships, winning all 22 gold medals. And as you might have guessed, the team was looking forward to returning home to properly celebrate their accomplishments. In order to go home, the team would have to take a flight from Venezuela to Trinidad, then to Barbados, then to Jamaica, and finally land in Cuba. In Barbados, the team boarded Cubana Airlines Flight 455, where the Cubans were just 57 of the 73 persons on the flight. The others on the plane were 11 Guyanese passengers, most of whom were completing medical studies in Cuba, and 5 North Korean passengers. In total, there were 48 passengers and 25 crew members. The flight was scheduled to leave at 11:21 a.m., but a labor strike at the airport caused it to be delayed for an hour. At 12:45 p.m., the flight departed from Sewell International Airport, now called the Sir Grantley Adams Airport, for Jamaica. But the flight never made it to Jamaica. At around 9 minutes in the air, the first C-4 bomb, placed under seat 10 beside the left wing, went off. The 2 pilots, Wilfredo Perez and Miguel Espinosa Cabrera, tried to steer the plane back to the airport. A recording retrieved later captured one of the pilots shouting, "We've had an explosion aboard. We are descending immediately. We have fire on board. We are requesting landing." Air traffic control gave clearance for the men to land the plane immediately. Emergency teams were on standby waiting for the plane to head back, but they were within 3 miles off the coast when the second bomb near the plane's washroom went off. It tore the plane in 2. The same recording captures Cabrera then shouting, "That's worse. Head toward the water. Fellow, head toward the water." Soon after, the plane crashed into the water. The entire incident occurred in less than 5 minutes. It was fishermen who were on the job off Barbados' coast who were the witnesses of the event. Those same fishermen would spur into action hours later, trying to find survivors and pick up pieces of the plane. In the end, all 73 persons were killed, with only 8 bodies recovered. Soon after, Cuban Minister of Foreign Affairs Ricardo Alarcon arranged for the return of the victims' bodies. Almost a week later, on October 15, 1976, Cuban President Fidel Castro delivered a speech at the funeral services at Havana's Plaza of the Revolution. With almost 1 million persons in attendance, Castro opened his speech saying, "Moved, mourning, outraged, we meet today in this historic square to bid farewell, if only symbolically, to the remains of our assassinated brothers and sisters in the brutal act of terrorism carried out against a civil plane in flight with 73 people on board, among whom 57 were Cubans. Most of the remains already lie in the abysmal depths of the ocean, with the tragedy denying to their next of kin even the consolation of their bodies. It has only been possible to recover the remains of 8 Cubans. Thus, they become the symbol of all those who fell. The only remains we will bury in our soil of those 57 healthy, vigorous, enthusiastic, devoted, and young fellow men of ours. Their average age was scarcely over 30 years, although their lives were nevertheless lives fully rich in their contribution to work, study, sports, and the affection of their closest relatives, and to the revolution. Immediately after news came through about the bombing, Bajan officials started investigating. Their technical examination concluded that the crash was caused by two explosions in the cabin area, which meant the bombs had to have been brought on in person. So those responsible had to either have committed suicide or had left the plane after planting the bombs. So upon looking through the master list of passengers, they realized that there were two passengers who boarded the plane in Trinidad without checking any luggage, but then left the plane in Barbados. Those two passengers were Freddy Lugo and Hernan Ricardo. Both men were Venezuelans, and just a day after the bombing, they were arrested in Port of Spain. According to Keith Balenda in his book, Voices from the Other Side, An Oral History of Terrorism Against Cuba, Freddy Lugo and Hernan Ricardo had boarded the plane in Port of Spain with the intention of planting two bombs in the rear part of the aircraft a few minutes before landing in Barbados. The plastic C4 explosives concealed in a photographer's bag were timed to go off approximately 1 hour after takeoff, giving the two men ample time to disembark and return to Trinidad. The plane was to have it destroyed over open waters where any evidence would be impossible to recover. The pair had failed to take into account the delay caused by the striking airport staff. During the investigation, Lugo and Ricardo stated that the masterminds behind the bombing were Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch. It was Ricardo who met the men through a private detective agency in Venezuela and convinced his friend Lugo to join him in the plan. The masterminds were a part of prior Cuban attacks. Bosch was linked to more than 50 bombings targeting Cubans. He was even arrested in Florida back in 1968 for attacking a Polish freighter en route to Cuba. Posada, on the other hand, was a part of the Cuban-American team that had invaded Cuba during the 1961 Bay of Pigs incident. Throughout the rest of the decade and the early 1970s, he served as a CIA agent. By the mid-70s, he founded the Coordination of United Revolutionary Organization, CORU, C-O-R-U, which the CIA described as, quote, an anti-Castro terrorist umbrella organization, end quote. Days after the bombing, CORU claimed responsibility for the attack. A declassified CIA document dated October 12, 1976, quoted Posada at a prior CORU meeting saying, "We are going to hit a Cuban airliner. Orlando has the details." Almost a year after the bombing, the Venezuelan government referred the case to a military court where Posada, Bosch, Lugo, and Ricardo were all charged for treason. However, 3 years later, a judge acquitted them. Upon outcry by prosecutors, the case was overturned over to a civil court. In August 1985, Lugo and Ricardo were sentenced to 20 years in prison. Bosch, on the other hand, was then acquitted on a technicality to which he returned illegally to the United States. However, he was detained by authorities for violating his parole over the 1968 Polish freighter attack. The Justice Department recommended that Bosch be deported back to Venezuela, citing him as one of the hemisphere's most deadly terrorists. Still, that never happened, as Bosch was pardoned by then United States President George Bush Sr. Posada was never sentenced, for the day before his day of judgment, he escaped from prison. He was then implicated in the bombings of Cuban hotels in 1997, which resulted in the death of an Italian tourist. In 2000, Posada was arrested during an attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro at a conference at the University of Panama. Authorities found more than 33 pounds of C4 explosives in the auditorium. In 2004, Posada was sentenced to prison for that incident, but 4 months later, then Panamanian President Mireya Moscoso issued him a pardon. Posada returned illegally to the U.S. in 2005, where just like Bosch, he was arrested by immigration authorities. Still, he was acquitted of these immigration violations in 2007. He died in Florida in 2018 at the age of 90. Up until his death, a warrant was still out for his arrest for the 1976 incident, but the United States refused to deport Posada, citing fears of him being tortured. Today, the tragedy is immortalized across the region. Every year, Havana residents make a pilgrimage to the Cristobal Colon Cemetery, where the remains from some of the victims of the bombing are laid. Monuments in remembrance of the victims were built in both Barbados and Guyana. In October 2019, Barbados' ambassador to CARICOM, David Camisong, called on the government to revisit a proposal to go to the United Nations to declare October 6 as UN International Day Against Terrorism. This was echoed again in 2022 by the Bayesian-based Coalition of Civic Society Organization. Then on December 6, 2022, during a CARICOM wreath-laying ceremony of the event, St. Vincent and the Grenadines Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonsalves announced that henceforth, October 6 will be known as Caribbean Day Against Terrorism. At the same ceremony, Guyanese President Dr. Irfan Ali stated that the bombing was, quote, the defining moment that strengthened the relationship between Cuba and the English-speaking Caribbean. He said, Cuba, Guyana, CARICOM did not succumb to terrorism, did not fall to terrorism, but grew stronger and built better relationships and advanced human dignity. However, it was the Bajan Prime Minister Mia Mottley who would sum up the legacy of the event and how the Caribbean will continue to move forward in spite of the tragedy. To quote her, may the memory of those who have fallen inspire us always to preach the virtues of love, justice, and solidarity, and may their memory always inspire us to preserve this Caribbean as a zone of peace. And with that, we call an end to this episode. To view the sources used in this episode and/or recommendations to learn more about the topic, visit our website at tenementyardmedia.com. A transcript of this episode will be available 5 days after it has been posted to podcast outlets. We'd also really love to hear from you. Follow our social media pages at tenementyard_ on Instagram, X or Twitter, and TikTok to view additional postings on this episode and updates on other content created by Tenement Yard Media. We're also open to conversation about this and other episodes and truly all happenings around Caribbean history and culture. Just a quick note before we leave, we're on Patreon at patreon.com/tenementyardmedia if you'd like to support the show with a monthly donation of as little as $1. You can also make a donation of your choice at tenementyardmedia.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Gabrielle, and this has been Lest We Forget, a historical podcast from Tenement Yard Media.